The idea of hominin catastrophism, the repeated extinction and replacement of human populations by incoming, fundamentally distinct groups, has a long intellectual history, and one that deserves far more scrutiny than it typically receives. At its core, this framework proposes that human evolution is not a continuous, branching and interwoven process, but rather a sequence of abrupt biological turnovers. One population disappears, another arrives, and the chain begins again. In its modern form, this logic underpins the widely accepted out-of-Africa replacement narrative, in which Neanderthals are depicted as a dead-end species wiped out and supplanted by a newly evolved Homo sapiens population expanding out of Africa around 60,000 years ago. The claim is often presented as a triumph of modern evolutionary science, a clean and decisive story supported by genetics and archaeology. But when examined closely, historically, conceptually and empirically, it begins to resemble something far older, a revival of catastrophist thinking that sits uneasily within a genuinely evolutionary framework. The intellectual roots of this perspective trace back to the early 19th century, particularly to the work of Georges Cuvier, who explained the fossil record through a series of catastrophic extinctions followed by repopulation events. This framework was explicitly anti-evolutionary. It denied continuity between fossil species and modern forms, instead asserting that each wave of life was created anew after disaster. Although Darwinian evolution later displaced this view in biology, it never fully disappeared from anthropology. It re-emerged in early paleoanthropology through figures such as Marcelin Boule, who interpreted Neanderthals as a fundamentally separate and inferior lineage incapable of contributing to modern humans. This was the decisive shift. Neanderthals were not simply different, they were classified as evolutionary dead ends. Once that assumption was in place, the rest of the narrative followed automatically. Modern humans must have arisen elsewhere, separately, and then replaced them. The fossil record, rather than being interpreted as a continuum, was partitioned into discrete, non-overlapping categories. The possibility that Neanderthals could be ancestral, or even partially ancestral, to modern humans was excluded from the outset. This was not a neutral inference drawn from evidence, it was a theoretical commitment that closely mirrored classical catastrophism. What is often overlooked is that this logic did not stop with Neanderthals. It was extended backward into earlier phases of human evolution, fragmenting populations that may in reality have formed part of a continuous and interconnected system. The same conceptual move, divide, isolate and replace, has been applied repeatedly across the Middle Pleistocene record. Instead of viewing sites such as Cima de los Huesos in Iberia, Jebel Irhoud in North Africa, and the Narmada Valley in South Asia as components of a shared evolutionary landscape, they have been assigned to separate lineages. Cima is treated as Proto-Neanderthal, Irhoud as early Homo sapiens, and Narmada as an ambiguous archaic form without clear descendants. Each is placed into a different category, a different branch of the evolutionary tree, and ultimately a different narrative of origin and fate. But this classification rests on the same assumption that underlies Neanderthal replacement, that morphological differences necessarily imply reproductive isolation and evolutionary discontinuity. That assumption is far from secure. A more coherent interpretation is to view these populations as part of a broad North Africa West Eurasia metapopulation, a distributed network of hominins connected across a vast geographic corridor stretching from the Atlantic coast of Africa through the Mediterranean basin and into South Asia. In this framework, Cima represents a Western expression of this system, exhibiting traits that would later become characteristic of Neanderthals. Irhoud represents a Southern expression, combining a modern-looking face with a more archaic cranial vault. Narmada, often neglected, may represent an Eastern extension, preserving robust features while also anticipating later developments in both directions. What unites these populations is not uniformity, but continuity. This continuity is precisely what hominin catastrophism obscures. By dividing the fossil record into discrete species that appear and disappear, it creates the illusion of multiple independent origins: Neanderthals in Europe, sapiens in Africa, archaic humans in Asia. Each lineage is imagined as evolving in isolation, separated by hard boundaries, and then interacting only through episodes of migration or replacement. The result is a fragmented narrative composed of disconnected evolutionary experiments. The metapopulation model offers a fundamentally different perspective. It envisions a long-standing network of populations distributed across a continuous ecological zone, periodically connected and separated by climatic fluctuations. During interglacial periods, when environments were more favorable, regions such as the Sahara and the Levant became permeable corridors, allowing populations to expand and interact. During glacial or arid phases, these populations fragmented into refugia, evolving locally but not independently. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this dynamic produced regional differentiation. Certain traits became more pronounced in specific areas: robust cranial features in Europe, more gracile facial structures in parts of Africa, various combinations elsewhere. But these differences emerged within a shared system, not as the result of separate origins. Gene flow, cultural exchange, and intermittent contact ensured that no population was ever completely isolated. From this perspective, the distinction between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens becomes less absolute. Rather than representing two separate species with independent origins, they can be understood as regional variants of a broader lineage that had already been evolving across Africa and Eurasia for a very long time. The differences between them, while significant, do not necessarily justify the kind of total separation implied by replacement models. Genetic evidence reinforces this view. The presence of Neanderthal DNA in all non-African populations demonstrates that these groups were not reproductively isolated. Denisovan admixture adds further complexity, revealing a pattern of repeated interaction among multiple populations. Rather than a single, clean replacement event, the genetic record points to a web of interconnections. Even within Africa, the idea of a single origin population has become increasingly difficult to sustain. Genetic studies reveal deep population structure and evidence of admixture among multiple groups over long periods. The notion of a single, discrete, out-of-Africa event begins to look less like a reflection of reality and more like a simplification imposed on a far more complex history. The archeological record tells a similar story. There is no clear, synchronous horizon marking the disappearance of Neanderthals across their range. Instead, their presence fades unevenly, with regional overlaps and transitional industries suggesting interaction rather than abrupt replacement. Cultural continuities, shared tool traditions, burial practices, and symbolic behaviors further blur the boundaries between populations. Once again, the evidence points away from catastrophe and toward continuity. Yet the replacement model persists, in part because it is conceptually simple and narratively powerful. It offers a clear sequence of events: origin, expansion, extinction. It aligns with an intuitive notion of progress, in which one population supplants another. But simplicity should not be mistaken for accuracy. Evolution, especially human evolution, rarely conforms to such clean patterns. The deeper issue is that hominin catastrophism imposes a framework of rupture onto a process that is fundamentally continuous. It transforms gradual transitions into discrete events, regional variation into species-level divisions, and interaction into replacement. It is, in essence, a modernized version of pre-Darwinian thinking, dressed in the language of genetics and paleoanthropology. When applied to earlier populations such as those represented by Sima, Irhoud, and Narmada, this framework becomes even more problematic. These sites do not fit neatly into isolated lineages. They display combinations of traits that suggest ongoing interaction and shared ancestry. Treating them as separate origins requires ignoring or minimizing these connections. Reframing them as part of a single metapopulation does not eliminate all uncertainties, but it provides a more coherent account of the available evidence. It explains the mosaic nature of many fossils, the overlapping distribution of traits, and the genetic signals of admixture. It also aligns with what is known about how populations behave over large geographic scales and long-time periods. In this context, the emergence of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens is not a story of independent origins followed by replacement, but of divergence within a shared system. Different regions emphasize different traits, but all remained part of a broader network. Over time, certain variants became more dominant, while others diminished, but the process was gradual and interconnected. The so-called replacement of Neanderthals then begins to look less like a decisive biological event and more like an artifact of classification, a consequence of dividing a continuous evolutionary process into discrete categories. The same applies to earlier transitions. The appearance of new species often reflects shifts in emphasis within a metapopulation rather than the emergence of entirely new lineages. The implications are far-reaching. If human evolution is understood as a network rather than a sequence of replacements, then the search for single origins and singular migration events becomes less meaningful. Instead, attention shifts to patterns of connectivity, regional variation, and long-term interaction. This does not mean that extinction and replacement never occurred. Some populations undoubtedly disappeared and others expanded. But these processes were embedded within a broader framework of continuity. They were local and partial, not global and absolute. Hominin catastrophism, by contrast, elevates these local events into universal principles. It turns the exception into the rule, and in doing so distorts the overall picture of human evolution. A more balanced approach recognizes that the human story is neither a simple progression nor a series of abrupt replacements. It is a complex, overlapping process shaped by geography, climate, and interaction. Populations diverge and reconnect, traits emerge and spread, and the boundaries between groups remain fluid. Within this framework, Neanderthals are not a failed experiment, and Homo sapiens are not a sudden arrival. Both are expressions of a deeper and more ancient lineage, one that spans continents and time periods. The populations represented at Sima, Irhud, and Narmada are not isolated beginnings, but integral parts of that lineage. Seen in this light, the narrative of replacement gives way to a narrative of transformation. The focus shifts from endings to continuities, from extinction to integration, from isolation to interaction, and perhaps most importantly, it restores evolution to its proper form, not as a sequence of catastrophes, but as a continuous dynamic process unfolding across a connected world. Thanks for watching, and please like and subscribe if you learned something.